I sometimes get sad because I realize that I'm making the mistake of assuming my entire audience is as smart as I am. And it's not the entire audience. You know, there are a lot of dummies out there, unfortunately.
If you've been a comics fan for a certain amount of time, you've heard the stories. The big bad John Byrne stories.
Podcast Dark Horse Presents Aliens. Warning, deactivating language censorship. Spoilers activated. Engaging.
So let's see, what would be a natural starting point? Or an unnatural starting point, maybe even better. Okay, let's do this. What is your relationship with the previews catalog? When did you start getting a previews catalog? And
I was trying to look at this. Like, I feel like, because I was looking and I was like, oh, there were different volumes of previews. And I was like, shit, I don't remember that. I kept thinking it was just, previews and then there's like a gabillion of them or whatever. But I feel like the previews in like 1989 or 90 or whenever the hell it started, like I must have not been getting all of those. Like, that's probably when I first, I don't know. I'd say like 89-ish is when I first discovered like direct market comic book shops. So I probably wasn't savvy enough to know you could buy the previews catalog, or maybe that wasn't even an option for some stores at some point. Maybe it was like something they just kept to themselves or whatever. But what I distinctly remember was in this era, like the I guess, what is it? Like 93, I think. It's like around that time frame, it was like I remember either being in high school and going to the different comic shops in the area and stuff like that. And I think that was a period where I think I did. I mean, it was like you were buying Wizard, you were buying previews, like the whole, reading the TV guide so you don't have to watch everything that's on TV. It was like that's why people bought Wizard and previews, because you could look at the little blurbs and go, oh, okay, I know what the hell's going on in X-Men. I know what the hell's going on in Spider-Man, even if you weren't buying it, because you kind of follow along with stuff like that. And I guess like there's always the stories people tell about, oh, there's some special item in here that I didn't know existed that I could ask, the comic shop to order for me or whatever. I don't know. It's weird. I can't remember necessarily doing something like that, but I do remember buying previews and maybe transitioning. I specifically remember reading Earth Angel in preview, which was kind of excruciating. It was kind of like reading the Kang Dynasty issue to issue. Like it was like there was like what 2 or 3 pages at a time, and you're just like, for fuck's sake, come on, like give me some more. But I think I was definitely, if it wasn't my copy of previews, it was somebody else's copy of previews. But I'm pretty sure I was buying previews at that point, pretty consistently, or at least that I had a bunch of previews catalogs, and that was something that you pour over and, I don't know, make your little mental wish list, if not an actual. See, I don't remember actually like writing down stuff and going, here's my little list of things for the comic shop to order. I think it was all just, a mental thing. And then when it showed up in the store, I would buy it. But that's kind of how my memory of it works.
I had a corner comic shop very briefly in 87, and then we moved, and you came back to Texas a year or so later, and they finally opened up an actual place I could go to routinely in 89, or I discovered it in 89, and I went there pretty regularly. That was the first time I had access to a comic shop on a stable basis for any period of time. And I remember, I don't know if I was picking up independent comic books that were advertising the previews. I think that might have been the case. Or it might have been that the retailer had a copy on his counter. I think he did.
Yeah.
And so I would kind of see that and made me flip through it a little bit, but I just wasn't at that level yet. Like, I had come from the newsstand and flea markets, and so just getting access to a comic shop was already a big deal for me, and I only had so much disposable income, and he had a decent selection of books, so I just wasn't in a place where like you said, why would I, what's a pull box? I didn't even know what that was. I didn't know that you could use this catalog to order stuff. I just saw it and kind of looked at it. I was like, okay, that's interesting, and then I went and I looked at the shelves, or I went to the quarter bins, and then he up and closed. We had the Mayfly period of comic shops. They come, they go, they come, they go, or that period where everybody had comic books, but they tended to have the same stuff. And so for me, me, I finally realized that if I wanted to get the kind of more specialized stuff that I was getting into, that I was going to have to pre-order some of this stuff. And so it was right around the time of X-Men #1, because I remember pre-ordering that one, that I started ordering from the Advance Comics catalog, because that was the only one that the particular dealer I was going to at a flea market had. And then I moved to Colorado, and there was another neighborhood shop, blessedly, way closer, like on my way home from school. It was awesome. And I had a good relationship with the guy, but he had previews, and I didn't know why one guy had an Advanced Comics, one guy had a previews, but that's what he had. And I started picking up previews from him with issue 34, October 1991, because it had the wraparound original John Romita Jr. cover for the crossover where it had Punisher and Ghost Rider and Wolverine in it. Something, Ghosts of Darkness or something.
Hearts of Darkness,
yeah. The one with Mephisto's kit. And so for the time that I was in Colorado, I would use the previews, and then I came back to Texas, and, you know, different shops had different stuff. So initially I would just get whatever the shop that I was going to had. But at the peak of collector mania, especially once I was starting to transition into being a retailer, I just got them both, because they both had like qualities to them that were interesting to me. So I wanted to be able to check out both things, and sometimes they would have different things available too. You know, some catalogs had things that the other one didn't have. So I was getting both in this time period, and I really didn't think that I'd read the story month to month, but I went and I looked at the covers at Comic Vine, and sure enough, I had every single damned one of these things. So like you, I read it month to month, and it was only 2 pages a month. And what it reminded me of, especially in rereading it, is when I was a kid, I would occasionally get access to newspapers. And, you know, anything that looked like a comic book I wanted to read, so of course I wanted to read the funnies, and I would read pretty much all the funnies. You know, you'd have like a Mary Worth or Apartment 3G, where it's like, even as a child, I'm like, why am I doing this myself? But it's only 4 panels, so I would even read those damn things. But I found I liked the gag strips. I did not like any of the adventure strips, not even Spider-Man, because even though they had Spider-Man, I just had trouble with the format. And even to this day, when I'm occasionally trying to buy those collections like IDW does, I just don't like the format. I don't like where you spend 1 panel recapping, and you've got 1 or 2 panels to advance the story, and then a final panel to set up the next day's panels. It's just the least organic method of storytelling, the most frustrating, the least rhythmic. It's just, I can't stand it. And rereading Earth Angel, for the first time reading it in one sitting too, as opposed to those little snippets, everything that I hate about comic strip is present in this thing. And I really don't feel like Byrne himself was reading it from month to month. I think that he would have a vague idea where he was going to go. He'd do his 2 pages with half remembering what he'd done previously, just having a vague idea where he was going to go with it. And so it's one of the most disconnected comic books I've ever read, to be honest with you. It just doesn't feel like it flows at all.
I mean, I feel like it's telling, because I know we had the discussion about, you know, like the Alien 3 thing kind of killed my enthusiasm for Aliens, but I think because this was in previews, because and this might be a silly way to look at it, but to me, I felt like because I was getting to read this for free, you know, like I was already buying the previews, so these 2 pages were a bonus, right? Like it was something for free, and like I was irritated even though it was for free, but it was for free, and it was John Byrne doing Aliens, so there was something a little exciting about that, right? You're like, oh, this is John Byrne, it's a well-known, you know, writer, artist, creator, like, and he's doing Aliens, like this is gonna be cool. And it kind of wasn't, right? Like, I mean, it was this interesting little snapshot. It's like Byrne pre-disenfranchisement because of Image's popularity, I guess, sort of, kind of, or at least that he's good enough not to stick it in every comic he's working on, right? Like, and so it's like, I know you said it was disconnected, but I mean, as far as the art goes, and him doing his, what I usually like to call his Byrne clever shit, you know, like you know what, he knew what the ending of this was.
Earth angel, the one I adore.
Hey boy, you alright?
I can't play.
Earth Angel is named after the song Earth Angel. So it's set in the 1950s on planet Earth, and you're like, what the F? But anyway, that's a whole other tangent that I could go down. But it's set on planet Earth in the 1950s. This spaceship crash lands in the middle of this sort of I don't know, B-movie 50s town. I don't know if they ever told you where they were, but I didn't bother to figure it out. But it's some kind of, you know, small town American town where there are these greaser bikers who are up to a bunch of debauchery and so on and so forth. These kids come across the spaceship. They pull out the survivor, this pilot, and they mistake the face hugger for his face. They bring it back to their dad, who's a doctor. The doctor takes a look at it, and the face hugger comes off, obviously, because it's already impregnated the little embryo. Before they know it, the chest burster comes out of this alien creature's stomach. So now you've got a full-blown xenomorph with, I don't know, a big giant nutsack for a head, which was irritating to me because I wanted John Byrne to draw aliens, not a nutsack head. But that's what we got, xenomorph nutsack head, because the alien who crash landed was some kind of BEM, bug-eyed monster, you know, an homage to, I guess, you know, 50s sci-fi. That's the whole, I think that's the whole approach to this. This was supposed to be like a you know, 50s sci-fi romp, but infused with, you know, the aliens genre, you know, at the same time. And so this kind of bug-eyed, ball-sack headed alien xenomorph runs around. He slaughters a bunch of the biker guys and this and that, and somewhere along the way, which confuses me, there's eggs and embryos, and they start to impregnate some of the biker guys, and the doctor knows that all this is going on, and he's trying to get his wife and kid out of town. They're going to go stay at their mother's, but as they do this, they run into the xenomorph. They crash into it head on. It somehow the car engine combusts and ignites the alien, and he's pulling his daughter out, and they're all running away, and then the biker gang is surrounding them, and then the biker gang goes nuts trying to save their buddies, but they can't, and it's I don't know, it's semi-ridiculous, but the biker guys are, you know, it's like Fonzarelli or whatever the hell he's supposed to be, is like, you know, using his motorcycle to run over the face huggers and all this stuff, and then basically they sort of, I guess the doctor figures out like, oh hey, these things don't like fire, right? We can kill it with fire, you know, and so they burn all the eggs and burn everything up, and then, you know, before they know it, it's morning, and, you know, all these police and army guys are investigating and all this other stuff. It's like, what the hell happened and all this other stuff. And the punchline, which I think Byrne had planned from the outset, is the doctor stops at a nearby home, and they're like, hey, can we use your rotary dial-up phone and call Ma Bell, because we need to make a phone call. And he picks up the phone and starts talking to some people, and he's like, yes, oh, my name, it's Ripley. And it's like, da-dum-bum. You know, like, so that's, you know, this doctor who we've been following this whole time, that examined the face hugger, that saved his daughter from a ball-sack headed xenomorph, and figured out the only way to kill these things was with fire, is a ancestor of Ellen Ripley from the 1950s, at least if you want him to be. So I don't know. I just kind of, that was not a pre-can synopsis. That was just me shooting off the cuff, in case you hadn't noticed. But that's basically
the story doesn't rate like a deliberate synopsis. I literally, like, I was reading the comic at work during downtime, and I was reading a digital copy, and it was so erratic and so unclear. I literally thought that the digital copy must be flawed, so I went and I got the omnibus off the shelf and looked and was like, oh no, there's no balloons missing, there's no translation errors. This is the comic that was produced. Yeah, like I agree with you. I believe that he had the punchline the whole time, and I feel like the idea was, oh great, what I'll do is I'll homage, you know, the pod people and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I'll get a Steve McQueen type in there. I feel like he may have had a bunch of cool ideas, and I guess he just never got around to it. Maybe he had too many other things going on. Maybe he lost interest partway through and was just sort of going through the motions, which it really felt like there toward the end, where he wasn't even bothered with dialogue. He's just like, let's do 2 pages of fire and alien eggs burning and shit. And so what could have been neat is, again, showing, like, telling almost almost complete story on those 2 pages where it's like, okay, here's the blob homage, here's the them homage, and Matt finding a way of integrating the xenomorphs into that type of storytelling. But ultimately it just became this hash of period elements that didn't come of anything. And it's just, it's disheartening. It's like, you're better than this, John. You know, it's like I feel like this is a situation where you're like seeing his creative collapse in real time on a monthly basis in the previews catalog. It's just a damn shame. So having established that, like, what was your relationship with John Byrne prior to this period? Like, where were you introduced to him? What were your feelings toward him?
Yeah, I was a loyal follower, I think. I mean, I was, you know, I think if you look at the time frame of this stuff, he's doing NixedMen, which I was buying religiously, and then before that, he's doing Namor and She-Hulk, which I bought, and I only bought She-Hulk when, you know, I bought the first 8 issues, and then I bought it when he came back in like issue 38, 39, 37, I forget what one it was, but whenever he came back to the book, I started picking it up again, so I was buying that. And you know, I was buying, you know, a lot of my Spinner Rack comics were, you know, John Byrne Man of Steel, you know, John Byrne Superman, that kind of thing. So I feel like he was foundational as far as my I don't know, my comics nostalgia, my comics origin story. Like I can't remember a time when John Byrne wasn't there. And then if you throw in, like, you know, if you had to be a fucking cool kid, you had to know about the fucking X-Men, you know. So it's like there were classic X-Men reprints, there were trade paperbacks about the Dark Phoenix saga, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then I think a little later when you know, my buddy who really liked John, I'd say my buddy liked John Byrne way more than I did, because he was a big fan of Iron Fist, and through him I think I ended up seeing, you know, Iron Fist and a lot of the Fantastic Four run and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, later I think I would come to appreciate that Fantastic Four run, and ended up getting a lot of those kind of, you know, after the fact. I can't tell you I was buying Byrne Fantastic Four off the stands. Like, I came to it way later than that, but, you know, it's sort of in retrospect, you know, I came to that. But I mean, as far as like, you know, following him, like whatever it was, like even in terms of like him as a writer, you know what I mean? Like, I was buying, you know, the Armor Wars 2, which he didn't want to call it that, but I mean, I was buying that run of Iron Man, you know, any of the stuff that he had done with, you know, X-Men or Namor, even after he stopped doing the art, his little mini run on Wolverine, and, you know, the writing he did on Avengers, and especially Avengers West Coast, which he was doing the art for, like all that stuff, you know. I'm trying to think of like other DC stuff. Like he you know, besides Superman, he did like, he had that little run of the Batman stuff, you know, the many deaths of the Batman or whatever, that little, I think there was like a 3-issue run for that. So like all that stuff stands out in my mind and is, you know, something that I definitely followed all that stuff. I think a lot of it I probably have nostalgia about. I think I don't know, like I think after this I was still pretty loyal. I mean, I did continue to read NixedMen until it's finished. I read Danger Unlimited. I read what was that, the Torch of Liberty type stuff, you know, those backup stories and all that kind of stuff. Babe, like all those Dark Horse books that came out of that one book we talked about, the Critical Error or whatever the hell it was called, like that like those kind of books. And then I think even after that, like I was kind of a supporter, you know what I mean? Like I still read the Wonder Woman arc. I was always behind him working on New Gods, you know, so I was always supporting all those, you know, whether it was Fourth World or what, you know, whatever they were calling it. So I was always reading all that stuff. I think probably, like, I think everybody will agree, like, you know, beyond Earth War, you might have seen some degradation in or Earth War in Earth Angel. You might have seen some degradation in Earth Angel, but I mean, I think the thing that probably sealed the nail in the coffin for most people that read DC Comics would be Genesis, right? And then the thing that really like nailed the coffin for the Marvel people, I would think, is Chapter 1, you know, and all that kind of Howard Mackie era Spider-Man bullshit. Like that probably is where most people fell out of love with John Byrne. And that's not to say I still didn't follow like other projects that I saw here and there. You know, I I was the guy that still bought Hidden Years every month. Like, I know they said it was canceled to low sales. Well, I was that idiot that was still buying it. You know, the 10,000 people that were still buying it, I was one of those guys. So, I mean, there were plenty of things I still supported after the fact. So, but I think Chapter 1 and Genesis probably killed it for a lot of people. And then there's some stuff where you're just kind of like, you know, what is this? Like Lab Rats and his Doom Patrol whatever it was, revamp, you know, like all that kind of stuff. Like that was kind of like, you know, long after the fact. So as far as like later stuff, I'm trying to think like I really liked his Star Trek stuff, you know, the stuff he did for IDW, like the Leonard McCoy Frontier Doctor. Like I'm a fan of those. But otherwise, I think, you know, some basically sort of for me, post Genesis, post Chapter 1, like that's kind of when the ship had sailed. But what about you? Like, is your history with Byrne similar, different? Like,
definitely different, and yet not at the same time, because he's one of those guys that, because he was getting big in the time period where I was getting into you know, it's like I never got into comics. They were always there, and I was always into them. It's just like, you know. So yeah, I've talked about Primordial Character, these guys that were just around, and I have no recollection of when I was introduced to them. In terms of art, John Byrne is like that because he was a big name, did a lot of covers, produced a lot of material in that time period, and so I cannot put my finger on where I was introduced to this guy. It could have been house ads, it could have been covers. I know I bought Alpha Flight #1 when that came out, and I'm sure part of it was that it was #1, and that cover had all the Marvel heroes in it, and it's almost like, is this going to be the Secret Wars? Like, no, it wasn't Secret Wars for sure. And then I had like Phoenix the Untold Story, which was, you know, I thought was great, and you know, I kept getting exposed to him, and I think that John Byrne in his prime was one of those perfect comic book artists. There are guys like him and George Perez that just like draw the characters right. Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, yep. They're perfect. They're like, if you picture a superhero character, it's probably going to be one of those guys' drawings, and your mind just has to choose which one you favor the most. But those are the archetypes. Those are the most iconic versions of those characters typically when they were at their peak. But the weird thing is I was never a faithful John Byrne guy. And one thing that I've read about is how part of what made him a big name was that he had what some people call the Faithful 40. He calls the Faithful 50 because I think he likes to expand upon his fame. Jim Shooter has called it the Faithful 35,000. But basically, every time he did a book, you could assume that you were going to have a certain bump just by him drawing it, of like about 35,000 copies, 40,000 copies or so. And I definitely wasn't that guy, but I did buy a lot of those books. Like, of all the things, even when I was like not as into the Spider-Man as I used to be, Marvel Tales for a while there were reprinting his Marvel team-up stories with Chris Claremont, and I was buying that pretty routinely. I would occasionally buy Alpha Flight. I would check out Fantastic Four. I rarely bought it unless it came in a 3-pack, but a lot of times the barber shops in my neighborhood would have Fantastic Four randomly, probably because it was one of the more popular titles. So instead of paying money for it, I would just flip through it there or read through it there. And so I had some vague familiarity with that, but because I was never a Fantastic Four fan, even though I thought the book looked great, those characters were never compelling to me. I just didn't pick it up regularly. And so it took years before I'd actually buy something that Byrne did on a regular basis. And of all the things, it was Superman. I picked up one of the issues out of the scratched and dinged bin, and I fell in love with it. And for about 6 months there, John Byrne on Superman was my favorite thing, right? And I continued to buy, like my brother was into X-Men like I was, and he had comic shops and he had more disposable income than I did. So he was going back and buying the old John Byrne issues. Okay. So he had, you know, the 2-parter, the Days of Future Past. He had the Kitty Pryde story. He had her debut. He had a lot of that stuff. And, you know, later in the 80s, you had classic X-Men Classic, whatever you want to call it, where they started reprinting from the Cockrum run forward, the all new, all different X-Men. Yep. And so I had a lot of opportunities to experience John Byrne in his prime. I knew he was a great artist. I always enjoyed his work, but I was just never the guy who's going to buy a book just because John Byrne did it. I tried a lot of stuff, and I think this was maybe the key issue, is that when I would read my brother's classic X-Men comic books, I would dig those, and then when I'd go and I'd read something that typically, but from that point onward, was going to be written by John Byrne, his writing never really grabbed me. It was always just a little bit facile. You know, he never sucked me in the way that Claremont could suck me in. And so I continued to follow Claremont with a bunch of other artists, and John Byrne I would just come and go with, And so a lot of those series, like you talked about, that you were buying regularly, I would try a few issues. Like I tried She-Hulk for about 4 issues or so, and I didn't like how much it cost, and I just was like, I'm not that into this, and I just dropped it. And that's the thing that happened with most of the genres. Even Superman, as much as I loved it for a period of time there, it burned brightly, but not, indefinitely. And I didn't even make it till the end of his run on that title. So I've been wanting to address John Byrne for a long time on the Spawnometer podcast, because I think so many of these predecessors are so important to telling the Image story, or the guys who preceded Image. And, the time I really wanted to do it was for Savage Dragon, Savage Megaton Men, when I thought that'd be an entire show. And the joke in that comic book was that it was John Byrne's NixedMen, as in he's going to get bored with it and he's going to move on to the next thing very quickly. And apparently,
what was it, like Johnny Redbeard or some shit?
Yeah. And so for me, I had even less of an attention span for John Byrne's books than John Byrne did. Even I didn't make it to the end of his runs on all these short, books. So, I tried an issue of the Incredible Hulk, and he had a run of 8 issues, but I only had the 1/8 of his run, apparently.
Yeah, I think sometimes there were things that were either before my time or just kind of like what we describe as you were in the age of the newsstand, so you got what you got when you could get it, and what I got were things like Man of Steel and Superman and stuff like that, right? Whereas maybe I missed out on Incredible Hulk until I started reading those. What were those Marvel magazines that had like all that stuff collected? It was like Miller's Daredevil and I think that Incredible Hulk run and a bunch of other like famous stuff.
Yeah, those are weird things at a weird time, because I want to say that was like 94, 95 when they were doing that. And so the trade paperbacks had already started coming into vogue, and then randomly they were like, hey, we're going to do these big overpriced reprint editions at a time when virtually nobody's buying any of these floppy reprints anymore. So it was just so peculiar. I always wondered, like I sold a few of those, and I mostly sold it to the guys who just bought everything with a Marvel logo on it, regardless. You were like the one guy that I know of that's like, no, I bought that because I wanted to read that because I hadn't read these stories before.
Yeah, I don't think, what's funny is I think after that, because I feel like, what did you say, 94? Like whenever whenever the big bust came up around here, I feel like is when I finally was able to afford certain books. You know how like you always eyed things and you had to make decisions, right? So it's like, you had to buy certain things because you only had so much money, and you were like, oh well, I wanna get all the cool, I don't know. For me, it was like if it was an old FF issue that had Silver Surfer on it, then I'd be like, okay, I can invest the money on this Mylar wall book or whatever it was. Or in the case of like Byrne and X-Men, like you're talking about, I remember I did go out of my way to get the 129 with Kitty Pryde, and I went out of my way to get the 137 with the Death of the Phoenix, because I knew that was like this huge deal or whatever. But then some of the other wall books I went after were like 101 and 94 and things like like stuff like that, where I was like, oh, these are key issues and they're important and special and all this other stuff. And maybe some of the other ones, I can read it in the classic X-Men, and it's not, I'm not going to break the bank for it or whatever. And because of those things, like you said, Marvel Tales and classic X-Men, it was one of those things where I was like, oh well, I don't know, whatever the FF books were going for back then, whether it was $2 or $3 a pop or whatever they were in the back issue bins, I was like, I wasn't going to get a whole swath of them, for that, you know what I mean? I wasn't going to spend like $200, $300 to get a whole Byrne FF run. But when a lot of these stores went out of business, like that's when I went ape crap on stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like I would go and get all these shitty Image comics for 25 cents. I would go and get like entire swaths of, Byrne's FF run, or I would get, I think it was the weirdest thing, or maybe it's weird to some people, but like I was super into Batman because of the 89 movie and all that stuff. And I was still majorly into Batman by the time it was, I don't know, whatever time frame this is, 94, 95. And I would go to all these shops, and there were all these shops. I remember this one shop, I hated it because I think it was like that thing where you had to like pull it up and bring it to the counter, and they had to price it. And then they always priced it as something like, it's like something you'd think was like a $3 book. And they'd go, oh, this is $15. And you'd be like, fuck you. And then you'd leave, right? So that was the first store I went to when everybody was going out of business, because it was this Schadenfreude thing. And I was just like, I went in there and everything was like, I don't know, 50 cents or a quarter or what, they were done, right? And I was just like, and I went through and I was like, is Catwoman in this? Taking it. Is Joker in this? Taking it. Is Penguin in this? Taking it. Is Man-Bat in this? Like whoever the main, is Killer Croc? Taking it. Like if there's somebody on the cover that was like, a quote unquote main bad guy or whatever, I was just like, I'm taking all this shit. And it was like, that's kind of how I ended up reading most of like those older Byrne runs. But until then, like then a lot of that stuff, unless like I was buying certain things off the stand, like Man of Steel. Like I feel like, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I feel like my first introduction to Byrne would have been I don't know if I got Man of Steel 1 first, or if I got that Superman pretzel jar first, or pretzel tin, I guess is more accurate. And I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about, but there was this pretzel tin, and it sold Superman pretzels, and the pretzels were shaped like the Superman S. So you bought this tin, and it had all these pretzels in it. But on the wraparound of the tin was that I'm trying to remember, it was like a Smithsonian like exhibit of Superman covers and shit like that. And so there were all these famous covers on it, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, obviously Action Comics 1, Superman 1, like all these kind of key covers and issues and stuff. And that was like one of the first times I would look at those and go, oh geez, if I could only read what happens in those stories. And one of the covers was Man of Steel #1. Or like one of the covers was, speaking of Byrne, one of the covers was Action Comics 600, where they sort of, realize the whole Wonder Woman Superman team up, possible romance, and they fight Darkseid and that whole 9 yards. And then there was like a bunch of other stories because it was sort of modeled after all those old Silver Age, giant size issues and everything like that. But
I remember buying that one off the newsstand myself, off the spinner rack. Yep.
And so like those are like that pretzel tin, I think, is my earliest memory of John Byrne, I guess.
Yeah, again, it's funny you talk about that because, like, Man of Steel, for instance, I didn't read Man of Steel when it was coming out, but I remember going to one of the toy stores and they had a pack, and I don't know if it was a full set because I want to say it was in more of a blister pack as opposed to a bag, but it might have been just a 3-pack. But I remember them selling Man of Steel in a pack, and I was like, nah, I'm good. Or like again, Fantastic Four, I constantly had access to that. I had access to the free copies. I was seeing on the newsstand. I'd see it in the grocery store, the 3-packs, and I'd like meticulously avoided reading John Byrne's Fantastic Four. I can't even explain why it was. I flipped through it. I remember looking through the one that had them going back in time and trying to stop Nick Fury from killing Hitler. And just yeah. I was constantly flipping through them. It's like, wow, this is really nice artwork. And something about the stories, it was like John Byrne was almost like the anti-Giffen. It's like lots of people hated the Munoz period Giffen, and there's just something about that just compelled me to buy the comic book. If he's drawing Justice #7, I'm buying it. If he's drawing a thriller fill-in or whatever the hell, I'm buying it. Where with John Byrne, as much as I can appreciate the artistry, there's something about his storytelling, I guess, where it just didn't grab me. So I would appreciate the artwork and I would put it back. And you're talking about like John Byrne. I mean, you're talking about like Batman. One of the things I still have, I think to this day, is I have the black and white paperback reprint of the Untold Legend of the Batman.
Okay.
And again, that's one of those instances where, this guy is drawing such an iconic Batman that I know that Jim Aparo did part of it and John Byrne did part of it. And I had trouble telling who was who. If I can't tell a Jim Aparo Batman from a John Byrne Batman, that's an iconic fucking Batman. Let me tell you.
That might be because I mean I had that too. Maybe that was my earliest. I don't know.
They put that out again around the time of Batman '89. So probably that's when that was.
Maybe that's when I got it. I don't know.
But then right around that same,
I know I had it.
Yeah, and right not too much after that, he did the Batman 3D special, the big graphic novel, and
right.
I remember a friend having that one, and he either loaned it to me or maybe I traded for it for a little while, and then I got rid of it afterwards. But I remember looking through that, and it just didn't grab me the same way that the 70s material had.
Is there like because I feel like we're not on opposing sides of this or anything, but I'm just wondering because I feel like, and I've sort of thought about this recently in terms of like writer artists. Like I feel like there's something like just from where I'm coming from. from. Like, typically, every time I hear writer-artist announced with a new project, especially current projects, but even going back as far as, you know, things like the New 52 or even stuff that was coming out in the 90s or whatever, unless it was like a select amount of people that I can count on my left hand, my typical reaction to, ooh, it's done by the hot writer-artist, insert writer-artist here, I usually go, oh. Like, and what that usually means is, and usually it leans more in one direction than the other, but what that usually means is some hot artist is going to try to write a book not very well, or some, wonderful writer is going to try and convey his written word in art, and it will be, usually it'll be.
Well, I mean, it's almost like a hypothetical because, like, it almost never happens that way with writers. Like, I can think of a bunch of writers, like a Jonathan.
I was thinking about somebody like Bendis.
Yeah,
it's like
Brian Michael Bendis, Jonathan Hickman, these guys who, when they could not get an artist to draw their stuff, they drew their stuff, and the minute somebody would pay an artist to draw it for them, they were done.
Yeah, and so that I guess that's what I mean. Like, whichever direction it goes in, but like I said, usually yes, it goes in the other direction where it's like hot artists thinks they can write, and it's like it's funny to me because like you'd very rarely have a situation where, like, I don't know, I'm trying to, I mean, I know Grant Morrison and some of these guys do little thumbnails and stuff, and
Alan
everybody
Moore,
says how great they are and all this other stuff. But I mean, can you imagine whoever the hot du jour writer of the day going, oh yeah, I think I'm gonna, you're gonna give me my own book. It's gonna start at number 1, and by the way, I'm going to draw it too. Like no one would be like, oh yeah, of course. Like, and then they got all these little fucking Tom King stick figures in the fucking, you know what I mean? Like, and it looks like shit. Nobody would greenlight that fucking crap. And it's like that's why I always think, like, to me, it's like, and I get why John Byrne's head exploded, right? Because then you've got like, McFarlane doing Spider-Man #1. And it's like, oh, I think I'm gonna write now, and you're like, you're gonna write what? Like, you did what? Like, and anyway, like
Michael Jordan's still at the peak of his game. I'm gonna go play baseball now.
Yeah, it's like what? Anyway, but so there's that. So I guess this is my long-winded way of getting to, like, if it sounds to me, because I would consider John Byrne one of those guys on my left hand, right? Where if I heard he was doing, I mean, at least discounting. I know everybody's like, what about Chapter 1? What about Genesis? What about blah blah blah? Like, discounting all that shit. I'm just saying, like, in general, if especially back in what I considered his heyday, when I was presumably one of these 35,000 loyal or whatever the fuck they're called, right? Like, if I heard writer-artist John Byrne on Namor, writer-artist John Byrne on She-Hulk, writer-artist, John Byrne on Iron Man, or whatever, OMAC, like whatever the fuck it was, I was like, oh, cool, okay, I'm gonna check that out. Like, that was if somebody said writer-artist John Byrne on Kazar, you'd be goddamned, I'm gonna buy that Kazar book. Like, that's kind of, to me, it's like, oh, that sounds pretty cool, as opposed to most times if it was, say, writer-artist Todd McFarlane on Kazar, I'd be like, well, I guess maybe Shauna will look pretty, you know what I mean? Like, that's, so I guess, long-winded, but, like, are there any writer-artists that you would put on your, like somebody where you hear writer-artist and you're like, god damn, I'm gonna check that stuff out?
Well,
That's
I mean,
good?
for years mine was Jim Starlin, Okay. And that was like, I bought everything Jim Starlin did for years and years. So that'd be my John Byrne in that situation. But I think that's an interesting transition, because you were talking about, like, that remember, I don't know if you read Comic Buyer's Guide back in the 90s, but there was the whole big hubbub, the name withheld thing, where a lot of times creators would write into Comic Buyer's Guide, and it was sort of the public forum for the industry, and there was that infamous name withheld letter that talked about how much more valuable to comics the artist is than the writer, and how most writers are a bunch of hacks anyway, and that they should just let the artist draw you write the books that they're drawing, because they contribute more creatively anyway, and they're more essential to the medium, and created this whole big hubbub. Now, I don't know if he ever explicitly said it for sure, but we all know at this point that it was Eric Larson who did that. And I think it's interesting because John Byrne's a guy who had to prove himself as a writer. They didn't just give him a book to write. He was one of the top guys in the field, and when he wrote, he was at at minimum competent. Like there was nobody who was saying, oh, this guy can't write. He may not have been the strongest scripts, might not have been, at a caliber of the highest ranking guys in comic books at that particular point in time, but he could write as well as anybody, average writer. He's at least that good. When he was writing a book like The Thing for Ron Wilson, nobody's like, why did they let John Byrne write that? Because he did a good job on that book. There was some problem there. And then you get these Image guys who want to do the same thing. And I think that it was kind of besides the fact that John Byrne felt like he was a better artist than those guys and had stronger fundamentals. And, I think he felt like he was doing the best work of his career in that time period. It can't help that after being this trailblazer and proving himself, that these guys came out with crap that still outsold anything that he was doing in that time period.
Yep.
Those early Spider-Man issues are garbage and they're nigh on unreadable and they're painfully derivative. The whole, doom thing he stole from Walt Simonson on Thor. And they just let him do it, and the fans didn't know any better. And here's Byrne as a guy who I think probably thinks himself as an artist and as a writer at equal caliber. I think he thinks he's probably as good of a writer as an artist. And so for these guys to come in and do such terrible writing, I think was offensive to him as a fan and as a professional, but also just the fact that the sales weren't there. Because again, he had his faithful 50, and he had transitioned out of the mainstream comics, which was a weird thing because he had always prided himself on being a company man. He was such a fucking company man that he actually testified against Jack Kirby in his dispute with Marvel, explaining things like how work for hire worked and such. And he was a guy who always was well paid and well taken care of by Marvel. And so it's got to be a weird situation for him because he goes back and forth between Marvel and DC. And, he goes from the guy who did X-Men and the guy who did Superman to the She-Hulk guy, the Namor guy. He's just not necessarily getting the plum assignments anymore. He's doing the Avengers West Coast. So there's got to be some element of him feeling like he's transitioning into the B team.
I guess it's worth noting, that there was that brief attempt to have him be the writer on the
X-Men,
90s X-Men, right?
Yeah,
the run
were you reading Wizard Magazine when that was happening?
Yeah.
There was he talked to them so much about the industry and his feelings and what he was wanting to do with the X-Men and stuff. They had to break the interview into 2 parts. And I'm not even sure he was still scripting the book by the time the second part of the fucking interview came out.
Right. It was done, right? Because they just and there has to be something to that, right?
Right. I think he must have been trying to assert himself. Because remember, when he was the artist on Uncanny X-Men, because he was the guy doing the art, because he was Marvel Method, he was doing a lot of the plotting. I don't know to what degree. There's been some argument about that over the years. But he narratively was telling the story. And he definitely is somebody who would be willing, I think, to diverge from the writer's script if he felt like he had a better story to tell. And the synergy between the 2 creators was such that it became the biggest comic in the medium. So I feel like he's a guy who, coming at it from the other side, he's now the Claremont in this position. And he's not even the Claremont because he's only the scripter. It was established that I think that at the initial issues, it was Jim Lee, Will Portasio, and maybe even Bob Harris were in the mix for the plotting of the book. And he was just the guy who, the dialogue monkey.
He's filling in the balloons, right?
But he's talking about how in those interviews, I'm going to contribute and we're talking about things we're going to do and shit. And then he just fucking is gone. And it's not surprising because he has a tendency to do that. But after having this whole involved interview and all the things he's planning on doing, and I think there was an element of he's going to show up Chris. Now that Chris is gone, they're going to do X-Men right. And then they're like, well, right is not what you want to do. We're going to go do our own thing. We'll get fucking Scott Lobdell to write this dialogue. It's like, something fucked up happened there. And maybe I don't know because was he do you remember him being mouthy against the Image guys before, like Proto Image, before they were going off and doing Image? Or I don't remember.
I feel like it was all after the fact, but I that's just my memory of it. To me, I've always this has always been my tinfoil theory. Like, to me, his Wonder Woman run is a commentary, but it's also him giving up the ghost on things. Where it's like, to me, it's like, oh well, if all these other guys can draw this garbage and do all these lazy shortcuts and break panel borders without any logic, rhyme, or reason, guess what? I'm gonna do that on my Wonder Woman run, and I'm so lazy, I'm only gonna draw 2 stars on her fucking underwear because I'm a hip cool Image guy. Like that's what that whole, not the entire run, but like there was a strong tone of that for me me in that run where he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna be cool and take shortcuts too." Do you know what I mean? And it's like,
absolutely. Well, I did not have access to comic shops when NixedMen was getting started. Those early issues. I'd only gotten that previews a few months before the John Byrne cover to the previews that started the serialization of Aliens Earth Angel. And it's interesting because this was he got the cover previews that month because they were releasing a trade paperback collection of John Byrne's NixedMen. Not the series itself had already been out for a while. And I think
is that what that was? That was the trade.
That was the trade paperback, yeah. So
okay, that's why that was confusing me, because I was like, on that cover, I was like,
so late in the
cover
game,
to issue
93.
Well, the cover to it, I was like, isn't that the cover to issue 0, which collected all the Dark Horse Presents stories? And I was like, oh, but if it's the trade, it probably collected like 0 through 6 or 7 or something like that, right? Yeah. Okay.
I remember though when he was pushing the book before I had access to it, it was confusing me too, because you had the 2112 graphic novel, and then you had the new series, but also there was something that was serialized in Dark Horse Comics, and there's just a lot going on that I felt was a barrier to my picking up the books. But I remember he was talking about how at that point he was in his 40s by that point, and he remembered that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, but more Jack Kirby, was starting the Marvel Universe at roughly the same age. He was also over 40 and somebody who could conceivably be considered over the hill, but instead he started having his greatest creative streak in that middle-aged time period. And most everything that we remember Jack Kirby for, with the exception of Captain America, was from 40 from his 40s. And I think John Byrne, he went into NixedMen. This was going to be him finally doing his creator-owned work, and he clearly, if you look at the early issues of NixedMen, he was putting his all into that. I'm not sure that he was doing any other books in that time period, where often he would do 2 or more comics per month. There
were points where I think Namor and She-Hulk were still coming out, but then those slowly like wrapped up or whatever.
Yeah, I want to say by NixedMen he was done with the Marvel work. I want to say, but you'd know better than me, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, maybe you're right in terms of production, right? Like maybe he was already done with all those books by the time he started NixedMen. But I feel like there's a period where those overlapped. You know what I mean? Like in terms of being released, like you could get. I think there was maybe like 5 to 6 months, and maybe that's the lead time window or whatever. But I feel like there was that little gap of like at least half a year where you could get She-Hulk and Namor and John Byrne's NixedMen, and then eventually it gets to a point where it's like, nope, just NixedMen. You know what I mean? Like basically what you're saying. You know what I didn't? I don't know that I put this together, and it's been years since I've read NixedMen, so I don't know if this is true or not. But like, there was some talk about John Byrne was gonna do a 2099 book for Marvel, and then somehow that turned into what was the 2112 book, and then that 2112 book sort of rolled into
begat
NixedMen, right? Yeah. Like, so there's that weird notion for me where I was like, oh, so in some weird way 2099 made NixedMen, even though that's not, I mean, it's probably inaccurate.
That may be correct. I do remember that there was at least one book that was going to be a 2099 book that became something else. So that may have been the case, but I don't remember specifically, so I can't really speak to it. But yeah, he had been doing all that experimentation with zip tones on books like Namor and OMAC, but he also knew that doing a book like Namor and OMAC, he's not going to have the kind of sales that he used to have. And he would tell people, look, just because it's me doesn't mean this is going to sell through the roof. And they didn't. Right. And then he's doing Namor until Jay Lee takes over, and all of a sudden Jay Lee makes it a hot book. It's not, John Byrne did 2 years on that book, and all of a sudden the sales jump because Jay Lee's doing it. And Jay Lee's another guy who I really loved in that time period, but in terms of like technical skill was nowhere near John Byrne's level. Yeah. And made like weird bullshit shortcuts, aping guys like Mignola and Sienkiewicz, but badly. I mean, I love it, but it's him. It's cheap, shortcuts. And for him to be the artist that he was and to accomplish what he had, and to see that happen on his watch, that had to be a knife in the gut. And also, I think he was doing Namor with Jay Lee at the same time that he launches NixedMen, and he's cut back on the zipatones. He's doing more detail than ever. He's trying to compete with those guys, and he's not. And in fact, within a few months, like NixedMen debuted in early 92, if I recall correctly, and within 6 months, Image is happening, and he's not part of Image, and they're just absolutely destroying his sales numbers. But not only that, they're also sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I mean, nobody was talking about NixedMen after 6 months or so. You know, it just, the support had to just vanish in terms of like the retail support. And so it was down to his faithful 40, 35, whatever they were, to still be doing that stuff. And, you know, again, there's clearly animosity because it would have been so easy for Byrne to have gone to Image. Those guys loved him, but obviously there was bad blood there. And so instead he tries to create the anti-Image, as you'll recall. And you're talking about, well, what about the writer-artist? And that's really what Legend was, because you've got Frank Miller's Sin City. He did the Big Fat Kill miniseries under the Legend banner, that totaling 5 issues. He did 2 issues of Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot with Jeff Darrow in that time period. And the Martha Washington Goes to War miniseries came out, plus 2 specials, totaling 7 comics from Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons. You got Arthur Adams, Monkey Man, and O'Brien, and not being a prolific artist, only 3 issues of that ever come out. You've got Mike Mignola's Hellboy coming out, 2 miniseries, 2 specials, totaling 11 comics under the banner. You've got Mike Allred's Madman, who joins with the 2nd issue, sadly, and does it for 11 issues. Then he goes on a 3-year sabbatical, and by the time he comes back, there isn't a Legend anymore. Walt Simonson did a 1-issue special from Star Slammers in 96, probably some leftover stuff when he did Bravura, which was another attempt at a sort of anti-Image that featured guys like Jim Starlin, as mentioned, and Peter David, another notable Image Comics critic. Ironically, the longest creator to use the Legend label was Paul Chadwick, who I don't think would ever be considered on the same level as these other creators, but he did 3 concrete miniseries totaling 15 comics, ending in 1996. He was the last creator to have the Legend banner. Byrne himself, of course, did the 2112 graphic novel. He did NixedMen issues 19 through 30, which was the end of the first series. He did a total of 6 issues of Babe under the banner. He did 4 issues of Danger Unlimited. And these were the guys. So particularly, Frank Miller was a guy who arguably was more impactful as a writer than he was as an artist. And this is a guy who's heavily inspired by Will Eisner, who is the guy who is credited with creating the American graphic novel and one of the most important writer/artists of all time. Mike Mignola, I think, proved himself pretty well, even though he consistently used scripters. And in fact, the early issues of Hellboy were scripted by John Byrne, but he was still the main storyteller. He was still the driving engine. And if anything, the Mignola Hellboy verse, the BPRD universe, whatever you want to call it, that exceeded any influence Legend ever had. Mike Allred's a guy who, well, I don't think he's as strong of a writer as an artist. I really do enjoy him as a writer-artist. So he's another guy who, if he's doing a project, I would be inclined to check out, you know. But they tried to be the anti-Image. They tried to get the big guns from the late 70s and the 80s, the guys who were the contemporaries of John Byrne, and it just didn't happen. So that's got to be crushing professionally. You know, you're putting an element of your reputation at stake when you're trying to do something like Legend. And in particular, he was sort of the face of Legend, him and Mike Mignola. And Mignola goes off and he does his own thing. It just doesn't happen. It's got to be crushing for him. And then, of course, I would assume that he could have done NixedMen indefinitely if he wanted to. But once again, he does his 3 years. He realizes that NixedMen's never going to explode. One of the jokes is it's NixedMen, and he's known for X-Men. Right. And you're thinking that, oh, okay, well, it's John Byrne and Chris Claremont that are making the X-Men. Byrne's going to leave, and the X-Men are going to wilt on the vine, and it didn't. X-Men just continued to expand in fame, and Byrne, even though he was one of the hardest artists, one of the biggest artists, you know, arguably the biggest of the 80s, and still Alpha Flight never touched X-Men in sales. It was always 4th place or lower, where X-Men was on 2nd or 1st place consistently. NixedMen never touches those numbers. He tries to go back to X-Men repeatedly. He never does anywhere near the number. He's always this little side thing that nobody really has regard for. So it's so strange that a guy with his ego and a guy with his talent is still always kind of second best to somebody for his entire career. And I think, like you said, he leaves NixedMen. I think that was when he transitioned to Wonder Woman. And this is them trying to salvage Wonder Woman because it had finally become a hot book for the first time since George Perez did it. Arguably, it wasn't even that hot when George Perez did it because his sales on that were nowhere near the Teen Titans numbers. And he did the book for a long time with, I would say, a higher quality of artwork with stronger inking than he had done on his Titans work. And it just never got anywhere near those sales numbers where it was a legit hot book when Mike Deodato Jr. was doing it. And they're trying to continue that momentum. They could have just gotten like Ed Bennis or one of the Glass House guys to continue it to kind of look the same. But I think that they wanted to have a radical shift. They bring in John Byrne. As you said, in those early issues, I think most clearly he's aping McFarlane. He's using a lot of McFarlane techniques, and you see him trying to incorporate some of the image stuff. And yeah, he's doing some of the shortcuts, but also he is putting more lines more strategically, because like you look at Earth Angel, it's kind of a scribbly mess. There's stuff here that just looks rough, and he's putting too many lines without knowing what to do with it, where I think his work on Wonder Woman anticipates when Scott Hanna inks him on some of the Spider-Man stuff, where he's trying to go for that glossy, sleek image look. So he's still evolving his style, trying to reclaim audience ground that he's lost, and all he does is have a 3-year Robert Kanigher, knockoff fest. And if anything, you can see the deterioration and the apathy over the course of that Wonder Woman run, and he never recovers from that. Even when he goes back to Spider-Man, you look at Spider-Man, the Hidden Years, or even the stuff that Scott Hanna inked, which I think was the best looking stuff from that time period. Also, for some reason, John Burns thinks he's his best inker, and I think he's literally his worst inker. His Spider-Man stuff in the late 90s compared to the stuff he was doing in the 70s with Terry Austin inking him, get the fuck out of here, man. There's not even close. As much as he tried to claim that he was getting to be a better and better artist over the years, it's hard for him. He had to have seen his own decline. And I just don't think he could handle it, and it just got worse and worse year after year. It's a sad thing to see his career arc. He saw himself become the guys that he displaced when he did the Superman titles, and he kicked Kurt Swan and those kind of guys to the curb. He became Kurt Swan, basically. And again, he wanted to be a company man. He spent most of his years as a company man, and they never loved him back. He doesn't even have the kind. All he's got is royalties. And the sad thing is, like, Chris Claremont stayed with Uncanny X-Men, so he's got the royalties from all those years. And then Byrne, he left X-Men right around the time royalties were coming in, so I don't even think he gets royalties on his Uncanny X-Men run. So the crown jewel of him as a creator, he probably gets nothing from that because of when he decided to leave. If he had just stayed on and done that material during the Cockrum years even, or made it to the Paul Smith period instead of having Paul Smith get that money, he missed out on all those royalties, and he's got to know it. It's got to eat at him how much money he loses every year because he didn't just stick around and stay, play ball with Claremont. So I'm sure he just got enormous resentments as a result of that.
I know Jeanette Kahn instituted royalties for a lot of the DC creators, but I'm like, did Marvel? I always feel like Marvel is always like, I don't know, there's some shortcoming there, but maybe I don't know what the timetable is if they do.
Again, Jim Shooter, I think that he did great things in Marvel. I think that probably Marvel's best period after the Silver Age, and for me personally, a better period was under Jim Shooter, but you can never believe a damn thing the man says, or at least you only can half believe it. I remember he used to try to claim that he was the one who brought royalties into comic books, and It was bullshit. What had happened was DC's market share sucked, and they needed something to attract creators. So they're the ones who brought royalties in, but they had the levels at a number to where hardly anything sold well enough. So basically, if you weren't George Perez and Marv Wolfman on Titans, maybe Mike Grell on Warlord, something like that, you weren't going to get any royalties. So Jim Shooter would chide them as like, well, what does it matter if they've got royalties? Their books don't sell well enough for you to get any of them. But slowly, as DC started to do better, and there was just the heat of, look, if DC's offering this, why aren't you offering that? He started instituting more and more royalty opportunities. But I really don't think that the Marvel stuff has royalties until probably 84 or so. That's part of why I think it's so fucked that he decided to do Secret Wars for himself, because right around the time he really starts to get the royalties out there, he also makes a point of giving himself a book that has given him royalty money for years and years since he produced the damn thing. That's one of those perennial reprints that he's still making money off to this day, and he gave that to himself as editor-in-chief. But I don't think that anything that Byrne did on X-Men was qualified for royalties, because he left in like 80 or 81, and I guarantee there were no royalties at that point. I think that Marvel started, I want to say, again, I don't think it was even 83, I think it was maybe 84, 85 before they started giving royalties.
I always feel like it's a rigged system, right? Like, I'm always struck by when I watch, because now I'm watching the 3rd season of Stargirl, and it's like, Jeff Johns and I forget who else, created Courtney Whitmore, and I'm just kind of like, what happened to this whole like derivative character thing? Like shouldn't he have no royalties or no creator buy?
Weren't you a chief creative officer with the company? How is it that you're getting royalties?
Right. It's like so there's that aspect where I'm always struck by that, and I'm kind of like, well, obviously he rigged the system in his favor, just like you're talking about. Shooter gave himself a book when it's royalty. I mean, you know, if you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of yourself. But I always just find that fascinating, where it's like, well, how come, you know, I don't know, how come nobody gets any royalties for Power Girl or whoever? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, well, because it's derivative. I'm like, well, fucking Stargirl's not derivative. Like, come on, give me a break. But anyway, I think most of that stuff is doofy anyway. But it's just, you know, that kind of stuff is funny to me.
Going back to the X-Men stuff too, we read a pretty terrible Aliens comic, and the weird thing is John Byrne did a really good Aliens comic like a decade earlier. You know the one of which I speak?
You're talking about what was that, 142? Isn't that his last book? That's the thing where Kitty does the Christmas thing and all that? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, and that's one of the ones my brother had as a floppy. He helped to contribute to the scarcity of these books, because he'd grab a book like Mephisto's first appearance in Silver Surfer and then ultimately utterly destroy this thing. So, like, I don't think any of his books were in salvable condition within a few years of him having bought them. And I'm sure this one met the same fate. And yeah, I reread the issue. When was the last time you read this issue?
I don't know, years ago.
Yeah, I reread it, and I was like, it's always tough as a person who reads modern comic books to then go back and read a 1980 Claremont script.
Right.
It took a while to get through, but the art is gorgeous. The storytelling works extremely well. It's very much, we decided to take these demonic characters from, you know, one of the first all new, all different X-Men stories. I'm gonna say this very deliberately, Ungarai, and I do this because these characters are tied into like H.P. Lovecraft concepts and public domain concepts, and therefore they got tied into things like Conan through Robert E. Howard and stuff.
Oh, right.
And so,
okay.
like, I was trying to find out, well, what was the first appearance of the Ngarai? And they've got, like, I think the first appearance is something from the 1950s, because they somehow tied it into all this fucking public domain materials. But knowing, again, what a notorious racist Lovecraft was, I initially was trying to pronounce the name of these creatures in a different way, and it sounded like something that me as a white boy does not want to have recorded and broadcast anywhere. So I very deliberately am going to call these guys the Ngarai to make sure that doesn't happen. And if you go back to Uncanny X-Men 96, when Cockrum drew these characters, they're just a bunch of random monsters. You know, they don't have any sort of consistent design aesthetic, and there's like a king monster that the X-Men fight, and, you know, it's just a weird wackadoo thing, you know, and then you go jump ahead all these years to when they're revisiting the story, and they even give you the Evil Dead 2, we're basically retelling the story, but with brand new artists, you know, at a bigger budget, you know. The alien it's clearly modeled after the xenomorph, you know, there's no doubt about it. And the storytelling is Alien, where this creature's going around an isolated area and killing people one by one in brutal fashion. You get to the splash page, and you even have the title of the story, Demon, spelled out in this organic, you know, matter. And you can't help but look at that and then think about Walt Simonson's cover to the Alien adaptation a few years earlier, where they did that same thing, where the alien logo, it's not the alien logo, it's the word alien spelled out in biomatter, HR Giger goo type stuff. And it's pretty much Alien. It's Kitty's alone at the mansion. She's just barely joined the X-Men. It's the last story that she's going to have drawn by John Byrne, co-creator. And she's, you know, since everybody else has gone away, she's training in the danger room and trying to kind of feel herself. Unfortunately, this demon creature comes in through the attic and stalks her through the mansion. Since it's a supernatural creature, it's able to affect her even when she's phasing, so she is in mortal danger, and she's having to outsmart this creature. And after a long, involved chase, ultimately, she gets into the Blackbird and fires the ignition and burns the creature into dust, into ash, which is how Ripley dealt with the alien in the movie Aliens. So it's essentially a comic book adaptation of Alien, where they're transposing the main story elements from the movie into the comic book, and it holds up. Not only does it hold up as an entertaining, you know, ripoff, but I think it's a great introduction for readers to the character of Kitty Pryde. There's so many characters that are, you know, the potential cousin Olivers or factual cousin Olivers who just come in and nobody ever embraces them. They're all Danny Chases and stuff. And reading through the story, I'm sure that there are people who had their doubts about Kitty joining the X-Men, and I'm sure the whole reason why Kitty joined the X-Men is because they unintentionally killed off one of the main female characters, and Chris Claremont couldn't stand to have the gender imbalance there, so he had to bring in a new female character. And you have this issue devoted to showing how smart she is, how cool she is, how much she deserves being there, putting across, without Mary suing her, she's vulnerable. She's having to make up for her physical deficits against this creature. She's still learning her powers, and so she's not able to effectively use her powers against the creature, and her powers aren't fully functional because of the mystical nature of the creature, and so she's really under the gun. And so when she triumphs at the end of the story, you as the reader triumph with her and imprint upon her and are impressed by her, and she comes across in a way that so many other characters don't. And what I'm thinking of too is like essentially Claremont rips himself off about 100 issues later when he's trying to get Psylocke over. It's not as successful when she does it, but when Psylocke's trying to get away from Sabretooth at the end of the Mutant Massacre story arc, I think that she probably won over a fair few fans, probably not as many as Kitty, since like much of my generation had a crush on Kitty growing up. I'm definitely not immune to that. My first 4-color girlfriend, but it's such effective writing, and the thing that's fucked up about it is that it shows not only how great Byrne was, especially Burning by Terry Austin on the art front. It'd be so easy for this book to look like crap when they've rescanned it and they've recolored it and everything's done in flats and comparing it to modern comics, but no, it still looks great. But also it reminds you what an effective storyteller Chris Claremont could be, and I can't think of a single John Byrne story that was ever as compelling and did such a good job of putting a new character over as the one that he had, in collaboration with Chris Claremont. So it's a perfect example of the failings of John Byrne as a creator, unfortunately, while also showing him triumphant as an artist and a visual storyteller. Because like you said, there's none of that image bullshit. They're on a bunch of splash pages. He's not doing the Neil Adams funky cutaway stuff where this panel's moving into this panel. It's just mostly rectangles, but rectangles that move your eye quickly, that show a lot of great action, that builds tension and suspense, that especially thankfully Claremont cuts back on the dialogue somewhat and the captions somewhat so you can move fast enough to where you can feel momentum instead of being bogged down with captions. It's just a really great story, and it's a really great alien story, except it's not about one of the xenomorphs.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people probably point to it for, if they're fans of Kitty Pryde or whatever, or like, I don't know, people are doing their Christmas podcast, about comics, and that's something that's a go-to, I guess, because of the setting and everything like that. But yeah, I mean, I totally knew what you were talking about the minute you said it, so it was like, oh yeah. I mean, the most distinct thing I remember is the cover, because it's like, there's all the presents and the tree and the whatever it is, the whatever you called it, the Robert, the Cthulhu whatever thing, it's like it's there in the backdrop, trying to be a creeper on Kitty and stuff like that. But I mean, I guess that I mean, I think you said it right, like the whole, Byrne wanted Kitty to be a young Sigourney Weaver, and then what, Paul Smith comes along and it's a young Brooke Shields, type thing. So
and funnily enough, one of my first Uncanny X-Men issues was one of the ones drawn by Paul Smith, where she fights another creature that's very similar. This is pretty much the same story. She's in the mansion, she goes to a part where she's isolated, she comes across alien creatures that can mess with her phasing abilities, and she has to fight them off. Not this time she's not alone, she's got Lockheed to help her, but it's pretty much the same thing, and it's effective the second time too.
I think I ran out of Kitty Pryde stuff. I've just had like, well, I mean, no, I mean, I like the story, but and I totally see the connection. The only other place I could take it is I always get like those type of stories. Like it's like one of those things where you would think that that's a story with one of the Brood crashing to Earth, but then it's not. So that always trips me out, because it's like most times the Brood are the clear alien analogs in terms of Marvel species. Like the Brood are a total alien ripoff, whereas this is like a one-off. So I think people are more forgiving of it, because I mean, I don't know, I could be wrong, because I don't did this creature like, or its race like ever have a comeback or something? Like, was there a big giant Alan Moore Mothballs crossover that somebody did with these guys and I just don't know about it? But I don't ever remember this thing coming back into any other future stories.
There's a bunch of stories featuring these characters and variations on these characters, but no, they never hit the way that the Brood did. And again, here's John Byrne doing his alien knockoff, and it's great. But then, a year or so later, Dave Cockrum is tasked with coming up with some kind of alien race to back up Deathbird in Uncanny X-Men number 155, and he's told to basically draw the most, messed up looking thing that you could think of. And so he does, and it ends up being sort of kind of like a xenomorph. But when you look at the design, like you compare them one for one, the Brood have eyes, they have fangs, their heads have the 2 points to them. It's like they're definitely insectoid, they're definitely strongly recall the aliens, and very, very much in terms of how they breed is exactly like the aliens. But there's also, like, to some degree, they look less like the actual xenomorph design than the Angari did in this one story.
Right.
But certainly the certainly the brood, while not necessarily being like top tier, these guys have had a very long history, very iconic X-Men villains, particularly stories like that one where they compromise Wolverine and you got the cover where he's on his knees where he's part brood, broad Wolverine. And these guys keep coming back again and again. Very effective knockoffs. I mean, these guys have been in animation, right?
I think so. I guess I was going to tell you not to feel bad, because when I was first reading those Silvestri issues, I think I was young enough to where, and I didn't know any better. I was like, oh, it's the Broad, the evil X-Men villain, the Broad. I didn't know any better.
Those damn dirty dames.
Yeah, them broads. They're messing with Wolverine.
And again, Rom had the dire wraiths, and those are pretty much the xenomorphs too. And those are pretty great too. I missed them. I just never could get into the dire wraiths at like IDW and stuff, because there's something about that peculiar design. It's counterintuitive to draw these bulbous pink things with funky little like barbed tongues. They don't really look like the aliens, and yet they function pretty much just like the xenomorphs too, where the brood are kind of like a cross between the aliens and the Deadites from Evil Dead because of their speaking stuff, but they actually anticipate Mark Verheiden's take on the aliens with the telepathy, which keeps coming back in Aliens material that I'm reading. I wasn't aware of it because I didn't read most of that stuff in the time, but they keep reinforcing that the aliens communicate telepathically, and the brood actually anticipated them doing that by quite a few years. The Earth Angel story, it ran in Diamond's Previews Volume 3, number 1 through Volume 4, number 1, because they basically did volumes based on year as opposed to, it actually being anything new.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until I was looking at this, but now it makes sense. I was like, oh, there's different volumes for every year of previews.
Yeah. And the Aliens Earth Angel Collected Edition, the one-shot, which I believe was square-bound if I remember correctly, was released on August 23rd, 1994, the same month as John Byrne's X-Men number 27, which would have been toward the end of that series, and Babe number 2. You also had Aliens vs. Predator from his nemesis Chris Claremont, Deadliest of the Species number 7. Herc Mondo was having his serial in Dark Horse Comics number 24. Of all the comics, Earth Angel ranked 105th in unit sales, but because it was pricier, it was 64th in dollar share for August of 1994. It sold 41.3% as well as Amazing Spider-Man number 394 for the same $2.95 cover price. Capital City reported sales of 19,175 copies. By late 94, I think that we were getting close to the death of Capital City though, so quite possibly the book sold quite a bit better than doubling up, but you at least had that faithful 40,000 covered in sales on the collected edition, probably a fair bit more. So it sold pretty well. It was probably one of Byrne's better selling comic books from his time period.
I mean, I certainly bought the collected version, even though I found it tedious to read in the previews. And I think I hoped it was going to read better, but I think I understand what you're saying, where just because it's collected doesn't mean it reads any better.
It'd been nice, maybe some bridging material or something, but I think it's literally just, okay, we took it out of the previews, we stuck it into this book, and here's a new wraparound cover. Who's that, I think, too? So you bought it because of John Byrne, you bought it because it's collecting this material you were familiar with, but were you buying any other Alien stuff, or was this basically the tombstone on your collecting of Alien stuff?
I think so, aside from, I mean, the only other stuff I can remember now is when they started, crossing with, when it was the Wrights and Batman aliens and the Jurgens and Nolan, Superman aliens, like that kind of stuff. I think I would come back for, and it was more, for the Superman Batman stuff than it was for the alien stuff. You know what I guess I never got to say was we keep talking about how disappointing the story was. Like, I think I just never got into the premise, like the whole, I understand conceptually, it's like, oh, I'm doing a 1950s, B movie with aliens. And it was one of those things where this setup of them being on Earth, like, bothers me about as much as Requiem does. You know what I mean? Like, and it's funny to me because it's like, I can kind of skirt the first AVP movie taking place on Earth, because it's like, like in Antarctica and it's a pyramid and it's abandoned and all this other shit happened like 50 billion years ago. And I'm like, okay, well, that's, kind of isolated. But I was always just like, when I was reading this, I was kind of like, even as a kid, I was like, it's so, I don't know what it is. It just doesn't make sense. It's just like, oh yeah, a spaceship. It crashed in 1950s in the middle of America. And now there's a xenomorph. And I'm just like, really? Like that's something about that just always struck me wrong. And I feel like that's one of those things where it drove me up the wall about AVP Requiem too. And it's not the 1950s, but I mean, what's the difference? It's I forget when that movie came out, but like the 2010s, the early 2000s, like whatever it was, it's just, oh yeah, predators are here and aliens are here and just they're just here, and it's like that. There's something about, to me, like there's something, sacred about, those first two movies. And I feel like if you're trying to say like this happened like, hundreds of years before that, it sort of feels, it rings false to me, I guess. I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's just an overreaction, but like that's always been something that always stuck in my craw about this and some other, like those ancillary movies and everything where it just never worked for me.
Yeah. And I'm on the same page with you because I saw Aliens vs. Predator in the theater. I did not appreciate that it was taking place in the modern day, but they had, they no prized it basically. It's like, look, it's the Predators. The Predators are very good about blowing anything up that, that they don't want anything to be, exposing their kind or allowing a technology to escape, allowing aliens to escape. Quite possibly that a method of operation could be based around their interactions with the aliens and recognizing that if you don't completely obliterate these things, you're never going to be able to get rid of them. But it's hard to read the Dark Horse comics the franchise launching comics and seeing how rapidly these guys took over Earth several hundred years in the future with much more advanced technology, and then imagine that these guys could land on Earth in the 1950s and be taken out. And again, for no prizes, one thing I'll say is they came out of that one alien, and I'm just going to assume that alien is made out of like sponge. Like it's a little like a sponge that's articulated, and that these are like the most inferior flammable aliens possible as a result of that. There's no prize number one. What I really would have liked to have seen is if you're going to go through the trouble of setting an alien story in the 50s, why don't you have just like this hyper aggressive response? Like as soon as people see these things, maybe it's meta and they recognize pod people and they're just like, we've got to obliterate these things completely. And it's like you could actually lampoon that sort of Red Scare, paranoia, hyper militarization, and it actually having been effective in this instance because if they didn't eradicate the aliens, we would be doomed. So you almost like play around with, well, were they right to be that way? There's so many things you could have done with this story where, as much as I don't want a 50 set xenomorph story, I could see how you could have made it work and made it much more interesting and much more fun. And this story is none of those things. It's like, I think that the biggest kick I got out of this story is when we're in the biker bar and the one biker's like feeling up the girl on his lap and saying like cursing. And I was like, I wonder if they bleeped that out in the previews. And that's kind of, raw for a 1994 catalog story, but the actual tale it really feels like, again, he committed to it. He maybe did one or two that he was into, and I think he just completely lost interest and didn't develop any of the ideas at all. And it just became this thing this chore that he had to get done with. There was potential there. It wasn't realized. It's not the story I wanted to read. It's not, but it sucks that me as just a lay person can look at that and see the potential, and a talent like John Byrne chose not to. And I feel like that has to be a choice or just a hand wave of disinterest. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe he thought that they would give him exposure. Maybe he thought that he would get some of that aliens heat. That didn't happen. And I think it's maybe just one in a series of disappointments, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I part of me thinks like if you look at it in the context of, oh, this is just a 2-page thing for previews, then there's certain aspects where you can be more forgiving of what kind of expectations should you have for a quote unquote free 2-page, like you're saying, comic strip, that follows that sort of structure, which of course is annoying, right? But what kind of expectations could you have? Now, I suppose if this was advertised as it was released in 1994, the collected version where they're like, oh, and you had never heard of this, if I had never known about the 2-page previews, then I think I mean, kind of like what you're going through now. Like I feel like that's like a major league disappointment, because you think, oh, John Byrne, star creator, like this is an Aliens, like this, the two great things that should be great together, and then it turns out they're like, it's it's okay, it's like whatever, like and so that's I think that's where the major disappointment comes into it. The way it's sold as that collected version or whatever, and it's not just a, I don't know, for funsies thing. Whereas I feel like maybe the only catch-22 I can give it is that maybe he was just it was something for funsies on the side. You know what I mean? Like he was doing a few pages for funsies, and then like you said, maybe it got annoying doing it for funsies, because it was less for funsies when he had to get the whatever the page number, 26 pages, like whatever it turned out to be in total, and he went, this is like maybe this would have been either, like you're saying, maybe it would have been better served to either expand on the concepts and really play up that 50s kind of craziness, that sci-fi craziness, the allegory, like whatever kind of atmosphere was permeating, whether in the time or in the genre of sci-fi, or maybe another approach would have been, why does it have to be so many pages? You know what I mean? Like maybe they could have got across what he was doing for funsies in 8 pages, and it would have just been a cool little short story that you went, oh fuck, like look at that little cool story that John Byrne did where the alien landed and ate some bikers. Like that's pretty sweet, and then that would have been the end of it, like and like you said, maybe it's by page 7 or page 8 it's the full blunt response, Army Hammer comes in or whatever and wipes them all out in a single blast or something, and that's it. I don't know. So
I remember that Simon Bisley interview where he was talking about how he didn't like Aliens because the alien in the first movie was just an absolute killing machine, and when you have dozens of them, it should be proportionate, and they were too easy to kill in Aliens. And then we're looking at this, and it's like I just Simon Bisley somewhere just shaking his head at what John Byrne has wrought here. Yeah.
Well, and then of course he's got a nutsack for a head. That guy.
Now that part I think Bison Bisley would appreciate. It's like, oh, I think that's his humor right there.
You're no prize. It doesn't hold up to snuff with the rest of the clan or something. I don't know. It's just yeah.
And like the bikers, we've hit this wall and we're collapsing. Clearly, it's like, okay, well, we ran over as many facehuggers as we could.
We did what we could. We ran over all the facehuggers, and then we can go back to our bar and swap stories or whatever it is.
Feel up random chicks, yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
AJ Lowe, Alice at Roland Cedar, Between the Pages blog, Billy Hines, CH, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Comics Classicos, The Comic Crush, Dear Watchers, a Marvel What If podcast, Del Dracula, Doc Strange, Dirk Ashton, Ed Moore, Ensign Lamar the Revenger, Francisco A. Herranz, Galipa, History of Comics on Film, I Was Joe Is, Jeffrey Brown They Them, Johnny DC, Keith G. Baker, King Size Comics Giant Size Fun Podcast, Lee at Gutsy Bot, Mark Wilkins, Martin Kessler, Martin N, Commissions Open, Maxis Pro-Choice and Anti-Nazi, Michael Anthony at The Meat of It, Mike at Send Aliens to Me, Mr. Cat in the Brain Reviews, Morphine Enjoyer, Manivican, Noblino, Otha Zachariah, Edward Los, Wordy, Rob Cave, Roddy, Satin Tights, a Wonder Woman Podcast, Seguano, Superbound, Tammy Martinez, Tio Travi, Treva, Bukov Cog, Wayne Burrows, Wonder Woman Warrior for Peace Podcast, Zarabi, and Whit Jameson. On Tumblr, Dark Horse presents Aliens Omnibus 2 Art Gallery was liked by Ulysses Reyna, Jordairo 2, The Johnnyism, Ripley Supremacy, Fanta of the Opera, and I Have Become Mistake Alien, while Rogue and The Predator vs. Tumblr was liked by Sharon Dare and I Have Become Mistake Alien. Because I bothered to record it earlier, I figured I'd let you know that Legend was succeeded by the Maverick imprint, which lasted from 1999 through 2002. It carried over from Legend Mike Mignola, Frank Miller, Mike Allred, Paul Chadwick, added some other legendary types. Matt Wagner, including 3 Grindel miniseries. Sergio Aragones, including 2 Groove miniseries. 33 issues of Stan Sakai's Usagi Yojimbo. Harvey P. Carr, Scott Morse, Dave Cooper, Neil Gaiman and John Bolton's Harlequin Valentine graphic novel, Will Eisner's Last Day in Vietnam graphic novel, P. Craig Russell's The Ring of the Nibelung, Tony Millionaire's Sock Monkey, Ricardo Delgado's Hieroglyph, and Shannon Wheeler's Too Much Coffee Man's Parade of Tirade. Hell's MP tweeted, Magnus fought a predator. Rob Cave tweeted, I have an abiding love for Predator vs. Magnus, a comic doubly orphaned from the publishers who commissioned it. I'm big on Aliens, Predator, Deadliest of the Species. Of the DC crossovers, Batman Aliens was great, Superman Aliens was okay, Batman Predator was outstanding, and Green Lantern Aliens was fantastic, but damn near impossible to find. Billy Hines tweeted, both Predator and Nexus crossovers made me want more Magnus. There was a Paul Smith annual, but it didn't get beyond there for me. I loved Batman Predator. 91, I was 15 and my exposure to Batman comics was minimal. The pinups broke my brain and primed the pump for great art to come. Given story is solid, and while I get your Andy post Jim Lee complaints, this isn't that. Andy's elevated by his brother Adams' inks and Ben Valkenburg's colors or the cherry. Magnus was unknown to me, but by the time I got to it a couple of years after release, I loved it. The Call of Weeks being influenced by Mignola is a good one. Weeks started Mazzucchelli, but brought in Mignola. Batman Predator 2 and 3 art also notable for me. I'm too young for Prime Galassi, so I came to Freaky Stare, Cataracts Galassi, all but manic. So I wasn't up for Batman Predator 2, but probably would be now. 3 in particular by Dixon, DiMaggio, Campanella is great. Bringing back the heat wave and incorporating Mr. Freeze to great effect. I agree about Predator losing every human encounter, making it look like a poor antagonist to aliens.
This has been a Rolled Spine podcast. All audio samples are believed covered under fair use laws. No copyright infringement is intended.
Coming in October, Dark Horse presents Aliens Labyrinth. With special guest Billy Hines.